Quick, everyone, turn your scale up. Turn your tessellation factor up. Let's get crazy. We are a tool using animal. And we should start acting as such. Because I think what happens with something like Substance Designer often, especially with students, is that they think about this just as a one-stop shop for making tiling textures, which I agree with. I do think this is where I make most of my tiling textures. But you can do much more than that with it. So in this case, we're thinking a little bit out of the box. We're using this just as a generator to create this kind of crater impact texture that doesn't tile, but we can use it for all sorts of different cool things. I'm going to show 3 examples of where I'm using this in a workflow somewhere else. And then we'll come back and actually build this because it's pretty easy and it piggybacks off of a lot of stuff we've been doing in previous videos. So here's the first of the 3 options. I have a different graph here, this sort of cobblestone. I know, classic. We're doing a lot of cobblestones these days. But in here, what I've done is I've dragged that whole node network, that crater node. I've just dragged that graph into here. And I'm using that to just spit out this alpha. I'm inverting it and I'm putting it through a tile generator. And I'm actually using that to splatter it all over this cobblestone to create this kind of procedural damaging and like impact craters wherever I want on the cobblestone. Let's turn our tessellation up. We go into material tessellation. I just want to make sure we have this scaling. Cool. So really sweet, right? I don't have to do anything fancy in this graph. Once I make this guy one time, I can reuse it in any material I want. And I can seed this, right? So I could take our crater graph and change the random seed, and I'm going to get a totally different crater, which is really cool. I could actually, if I wanted to, get a separate seed on this other graph, do the same thing here, right? So I just have my output inverting it. That guy, I prefer something that goes right to the edge, so like this. And I could have a second input on the tile generator and put him in. Put the wrong guy there. Read him. Actually, don't care to invert this one. Like this. Plug him in. And now it's picking, the tile generator is randomly picking between one of the 2 crater damages we built. And that makes a lot of sense. In the past, right, in Photoshop, you'd make these 2 versions and it takes a lot of time. It's really annoying. But here we just have these 2 graphs. We can make endless versions of it, which is awesome. And we can obviously do things like scale this up by just making those cracks bigger. Obviously, it's a little too big. But we can have some random scale. We can rotate them randomly, position them around the graph, give them random luminance so that some aren't as punched in as others. But you can see this is a really cool way of expanding on your other graphs and pre-packaging certain parts of your node network, in this case, that crater, and just reusing it in all your other materials. It's really cool. The added benefit is we could always hop back to this original graph, make any improvements or additional features to this graph, and it would carry through to any other material we're using it, which is really sweet. Another thing you can do is just output just the alpha from here. And I'm using this alpha in something like ZBrush to be able to drag this out. So I have a sphere here in ZBrush where I've created a brush that uses that alpha texture we loaded in from, we exported from Substance Designer. And I can just use that to create the exact same pattern, but when we're sculpting. Right, so this can speed you up a ton if you're just working on wanting to sculpt some stuff and bake that down. Or this can be anything. It need to be crater texture. You can make like fish scales or, leather skin or like wood textures, like whatever you want. You can just make them in Designer. And if you're going to use them to sculpt, it's really, really helpful. And just the same, I have 3 versions of the cracks. This is another one of those, hey, look, it's the guy from the thumbnail moments. But I can have these 3 different brushes that use the same alpha, and it can really speed up your sculpting depending on what you're making, right? We got a really cool result really quickly here with just that one graph. So that's the second thing you can do, right? Assist your sculpting with stuff you make in Substance Designer. Pretty handy. The last thing I'm going to show you is I have the same group of textures exported to Unreal, and I'm using them as a decal. So this is just a sphere, like a really simple sphere geometry here in just an empty Unreal level. And I actually have these textures loaded in as a decal material. So I can use that outputted texture from Designer to create decals. Pretty simple. But so you can see that we can duplicate this, have another one. But hopefully you're getting the idea that you should stop thinking about Substance Designer as just a thing that spits out brick textures, which is what I think a lot of people think about. Here I'm using it for these three. It's the same texture I'm making, and it's not tiling texture. It's just this kind of interesting decal or height map that would be more annoying to make in something like Photoshop or whatever. And I'm using it in these three very different ways, right? Either using it to improve other tiling textures, using it to improve sculpting and speed up sculpting workflow, or using it in something like Unreal to just help break up your big tiling textures with the aid of decals. Really, really cool. We're going to hop back into a graph and actually discuss how to make this thing. So we've gone to the graph where we're going to actually build that crater out. And I think it's worth noting that we're going to touch on a lot of stuff here that was mentioned in previous videos. So I'll put a link to all the relevant stuff in the description. I'll also put title card stuff up when they're relevant. The videos that were probably worth reviewing here are about flood fill, auto leveling a bevel, fixing all that stuff, and then some warp things. I'll make sure to put them all in the description so you can catch up. And like I said, I'll put them up on screen when they're relevant. But we're going to start. We need a cells pattern to create that initial texture, the initial crack texture. We're not going to use the default cells. We're going to make our own. The background on this first title card that's relevant is our video on creating a more interesting custom Voronoi noise. I would check that out. But essentially what we're going to do is get a tile sampler. We're going to get some squares. I'm just picking an arbitrary number right now. We'll do like 20 by 20. That's not enough. 20 by 20. We'll scale this guy down a bit. Give it some random position. We need random color as well, which is in the color rollout. Random color. You can probably scale them down a bit more even. We'll do something like 0.1. Like I said, you can actually set this to pixel and have them be a single pixel. It would work. It actually works better, especially if you resize the graph later. I'm just putting them as little squares right now because it's easy for you guys to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to take a shape and grab a cone. Because what I'm going to do is I want to have a different amount of, so for instance, if we just made the Voronoi like this, we take a distance, this gets run into source, we get an all white version using a histogram scanner level, whatever, to make a version of this point field where everything's white. Plug that into mask, set to full. So what we don't like this is on that impact crater we built, we sort of want smaller little bits at the center of the crater, and then they slowly get bigger. Think Dragon Ball Z, like combat battlefield stuff, like the bigger cracks are always at the edges. And then you get tiny spidery cracks as you get towards the middle. The problem is that this is all kind of evenly distributed, right? They're all kind of within the same size of each other. If we thin out how many we have here by just turning something like the random mask up, they get bigger. And the reason they're getting bigger, right, is that there's more distance between any of these seed points. So that when the distance works, they can spread further before they hit something. So the resulting cells are bigger. You can see it here if I play with the mask. The less I'm masking out, the closer they are together. The more I mask them out, the further away they are together. So what I kind of want to do is make two versions of this with different distributions. So this one will have much less than the top one. And all I'm going to do is mask this guy so that all of the dense stuff, I'll turn the mask map threshold up, all of the dense ones appear in this little circle. And then I'm going to invert this like this, plug him into here. And then this less dense one will only appear on the ring outside. So I'll turn the mask map threshold. Oh, that's a tongue twister. It's harder than it looks sometimes, I promise. So we have a really dense amount in the middle and much more sparse on the outside. And we're going to blend these together. We'll just use like a max. You could blend these together with a mask and ignore doing the second invert grayscale mask map here, but you risk getting like half of one, which can be an issue sometimes. So I like just separating like this because I can be sure they never double up. And you can see we have a texture now where there's way more in the middle and then much less dense outside. And if we run that, then we get these smaller cracks and they gradually get bigger, which is really neat. And then if we want them to get even bigger on the outside, what we could do is mask it so that there are none on the outside here. So I could take the same texture, our shape here of our cone. I'm going to set this to full, and I'm going to just multiply out here. So there's none in the middle, but there's also none on the extreme periphery. And then we get these really long streaks at the edge, right? You can see the difference. If I don't use that, we still get these kind of big ones. But if we mask out the edge, we get these big streaks off the end, which is really cool. And you can play with this too, if you wanted to bring it in more, something like that. That probably feels better. So we have these really long streaks from the impact. We have bigger stones and then smaller stones. And we can make this even more stones if we wanted to by just increasing the number of both these tile samplers. We could throw this to like 22. And we have more of them, something like that. So now we're going to edge detect this, and you can sort of see how we're going to start to get our cracks here to start that spider webbing crack detail. The issue with doing this is this is like the first big trick of the video. We don't really want the same width of crack for the little guys as we do for the big guys, because a crack width of this out on the big ones might actually feel pretty good, but it kind of erases the ones in the middle, right? Since they're so close to each other that an edge width that big erases them. So we would rather have two types of width, one from when you're up close, one from when you're far away, or one from when the cell is small, one from when the cell is big. It's actually really easy to do. I'm going to make an edge width or an edge detect that's really low scale, right? It's just a line. And we're going to make a flood fill. And I would check out our flood fill video. I think it's like the most popular upload at this point. A lot of stuff we're going to do today is keyed off of this flood fill node, so it makes sense to go check it out. So we take this guy, and we're going to use our flood fill to bounding box size, which we did touch on that video, if I could type the right note. So this just shades them darker based on how small the cell is, and brighter the brighter they are, which is pretty sweet. I might actually want a bit more, but we'll see. No, I think it's fine. Anyway, so we have this, and what we're going to do is distance this because we want to close up that gap in between. So we put the thing we're trying to distance into source. We put whatever went into the flood fill into the distance. Let's make some more room. It's always important to try to stay as organized as you can. Then I'm going to auto level this because I want to make sure that we have full value range. And now what's cool is we can histogram scan this and just mask out the smallest elements. Right, so if we do something like this and set the contrast to full, we're grabbing all of the little guys, right, are in black and all the bigger guys are in white. So I want to feather that a little bit. Something like this. Cool. Set that to full because we're getting a little bit of noise in there. Sweet. So what I'm going to do now is have two separate edge detects. One is our wide one, so I'm really only focusing on the big stones here. I want a bit of roundness and have some significant width. And then I'm going to make a second edge detect and focus on the small ones, where I'll make it a lot less round and a thinner crack. And now we can just blend between these two. So I want the big ones up top, the small ones in the bottom, and use this as a mask. And you may have to play with this a bit to get what you're happy with here. Something like this. I feel pretty good with that. But now we have these interesting different line widths, right? Like much thicker on the outside, thinner on the inside. Pretty sweet. And you could exaggerate this more if you wanted to add more, or add a bit more to the middle. Whatever you want to do, but you have that control to be able to change those. And like I said, you can seed this whole graph to get different unique versions, which is really sweet. So I like that, right? That we have this varied up line width. This is a thing that like students miss a lot, right? Is having just one line width for everything. Like generally you want to vary up your line weights. So I might thin this out in the small ones just a little bit more, and we'll call that a day. Cool. And I might actually change the threshold at which to start making them small. So something like this. Sweet. So that's sort of the first step. We're going to bevel this like so. Set it to full. I would recommend checking out our video on bevels and tricks for bevels because it'll explain why we need to do this, but we want a full range. And we'll plug this into normal. Let's give it a pretty strong normal map. We don't want this to be as smooth as it is right now, so make it a bit rougher. We're also going to plug this into height. And then let's make just quickly a second normal. Hello? We'll make a second normal. I'll just duplicate this one. What am I doing? I make mistakes all the time. Get a curvature smooth. And I'm going to just overlay this curvature so we have something nicer to look at. So switch this to grayscale so I can blend the curvature without having to convert it. Set it to overlay. And we're good. I'm also going to displace it at this point. I'm using the plain high res, so you don't really need to over tessellate it because there is so much geometry there already. So I'll scale this up. And there's sort of the first, I say we don't need to do it and I do it anyway. There's the first kind of look we have here. We've accidentally made a desert base for like a Warhammer miniature or something pretty quickly. But now comes the fun part. There's a couple things we want to touch on. We want to be able to change the angle of these cells so that they're more caved in towards the center of the crater and their outsides that are further away from the impact are up higher. And we also generally want all of the small cells in the middle to be pushed more down than the ones on the outside because we're trying to create this impact crater. So we're going to use a bunch of different flood fills for this. But the first thing I want to do is recover our flood fill because this mask won't necessarily make sense with all the stuff we've done up to here. And for a quick review on that, I have a video on how to recover a flood fill like this. It's up here. It's probably worth checking out. But we'll just do that here. We make our normal map. I think the strength of one is fine. We'll make a curvature Sobel because I'm using a normal Sobel. And then we'll histogram scan this. 50 plus 1. Full contrast. And because we have all these little squirrely bits, we may want to add a bit more. So this is a better mask to start that flood fill with, right? Because it's changed a lot since when we used it here. And we want it to stay as close to the current result as possible. But we're going to use a couple things here. The first thing we're going to use is a flood fill to gradient. Because what we would like to do, we need to make a flood fill first. What we would like to do is tilt all of these, right? So that they're deeper, like the black end is towards all facing the middle of the impact. In the white, right now, all the white is on the left side of these cells and the black is on the right side of these cells. We can't just give them angle variation here, make them random. But we'd like them all to be pointed towards the middle. And the way we do this is by supplying a slope input texture, which we haven't done before. So I'm going to make a shape and just make a cone, because this is really a good way of representing the impact crater, right? We're going from, think about it inverted, like this. The impact crater is deepest at its middle and brightest at its edge, right? So I'm going to plug that into slope input and then use the slope input image multiplier. And you'll see that it's using that texture to reorient itself. So now all of the texture is white where it's facing in towards the middle and black when it's facing away, which is the inverse of what we want. We can't just flip it 180 here. And now we have this cool texture where each of the cells are darker when they're facing towards the middle and brighter when they're facing away, which is really cool. Again, we'll want to distance this because we want to get rid of that black edge in between. So this goes to source. Whatever went into the flood fill will go into the mask. Only source, fill it up, and that's pretty sweet. And what we're going to do is start by just multiplying that against our original height map. And this is already really sweet, right? You can see how they all tilt up and away. And again, I'm just thinking Dragon Ball Z. I'm a big fan, and like, this is what I always remember from, you know, Krillin blowing through a mountain or whatever, or getting plastered into a cliff. This stuff looks great. You get that real kind of kinetic energy feeling of like an impact happening in the middle. So this is cool. However, we do want to make some improvements to this. We probably want to add a bit of randomness on top of this. So we could add a tiny bit of randomness so that they're not all perfectly aligned with the middle, right? If you put this to full, it's just totally random, which you might like too, depending on the look. I kind of like this look that they have a bit of a directionality to them, and then we add a bit of randomness on top. So that solves our first problem of having that kind of kinetic blast Krillin through the Namekian cliff type energy. What we want to do next is make it so that the craters in the middle, or rather the cells in the middle, are further down because that's where it's been pushed deeper. So to do that, I'm going to use a flood fill to grayscale. We'll plug our flood fill in. And this is just going to color the cells based on what texture is below them, right? So we would want to invert our cone here. And now we have the middle shapes are much blacker than on the outside, right? Which is going to have the effect of pushing the height map down. Same thing, I need a distance. Put that into source, whatever went into flood fill will go into the mask. Set to only source, put its distance to full. And then here we'll multiply it again, like so. And you'll see we're pushing the middle down. So it's deeper down than it is on the edges. I'm also going to put an auto level after this, just to make sure we get our full value range. And we probably need to increase the height on this a bit, on the actual displacement. So I'll go to my tessellation rollout, jack the scale up a little bit, or a lot, I guess. You can see what I mean. You can sort of see now where we're starting to go. The one thing I'd caution on this multiply is because we're multiplying by 0 here, right where there's black, we're actually flattening everything. You can see like the normal gets really weak just because everything here is, you know, the values are between like 0 and 0.05. Like there's so little variance. So I ease off of this a little. I don't multiply it as much. Just that we keep that level of fidelity in the middle, but we still have that impression of the big scoop being cut out. Really cool. Now what we need to do is create the edge of the crater, because right now it kind of extends all the way to the end, right? It tiles over, but we want to create that kind of central crater we had in the first example. So the way I'm going to do that is just to histogram scan this guy, like this, and choose the point at which I'll set the contrast to full. And this is sort of the edge of the crater, like where it'll stop. And I'll take this and just add him like that. Cool. But now, obviously what we don't like about this is we have the flat place Krillin has not launched through the cliff here. And then we have a sheer drop down to this really dark value. And you can see it here, right? We get all this smearing in. It doesn't make a ton of sense. We're sort of now thinking about the shape that does this, and then there's a V, right? Instead of it being flat and then having a nice V, we have these sheer drops that we want to get rid of. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to actually bevel this shape inward, set it to full. Again, watch the bevel tricks if you haven't seen it. Auto level this. And then I'm going to use this into another flood fill to grayscale. So we'll just reorganize this a little. Like this. So this guy is sort of like him, but he's much more reliant on this shape, which is cool because if we ever decide to change the bounds of the crater, he's going to come along for the ride. So we're going to distance this, put it into source. Whatever went into the flood fill, this guy should go into mask, only source, fully close it. And I'm actually just going to add this. We wanted that auto level here. I'm just pressing D to dock that node against the graph. We'll do a video on interface shortcuts. And I'm just going to add this texture to this one. So what that's going to do is these textures on the periphery are going to get a lot brighter. So they're going to step up. So I just add, and you get this, which looks super awesome. Really, really cool. And we have the added benefit of getting these like extra neat cracks here at the edge where you can see the beginning of the crater. Pretty slick. I really like the look of this. I smile whenever I make it. I think it's just really fun when it all comes together like this and looks really cool. And it's super seedable. Like I said, I'm double clicking on the graph and I can just change the seed and get a brand new crater potentially. It looks like there's some flood fill stuff we might have to fix in there on certain seeds, and that'd be easy enough to fix. Like here, for example, these all work, but this one fails. And that's just because this flood fill is failing here. So we actually might need the position to be a bit lower. Like that. And now they'll work better. Just something to keep in mind. Depending on the seed, you might have to, the settings you made in the one seed might not work. So you may have to go fix that one, and then the rest will all remain fixed. So that's really cool. I like the way this looks. As an added bonus here, something you can do to improve the look of this that I did, was I didn't like just how perfectly straight all these lines are. It can be cool if that's the look. You're looking for something a bit more cartoony, more simple. But if you want, actually first let's make a quick AO of this and multiply it. So we can see the depths of this a bit better. That looks really cool. One of the most disappointing things about a texture artist is oftentimes just the AO is the coolest looking texture. And it's only going to get worse from there as you add color. But that looks really slick. Really, really slick. So what I'm going to do is just make these not be perfectly straight lines. So what I'll do is at this step, I'll make this noise a bit less straight. So I'll get something like, you can do a lot of things here, but let's just like do a slope blur. It's maybe worth watching our video on slope blurs if you want to give it a shot. So I'll put this here and I'll find something like a crystal or whatever. Slope blur this, set it to full, set it to like min or something. And I might actually, right now it's only this horizontal noise, so I'm probably going to make a horizontal one and a vertical one, overlay them together, and then warp using that. Right, so I'm just using this to break up the shape a bit. I have it set to min, because I just don't want a perfect, it's probably better to have it on blur. And then I'll just scan this a little bit. So this shape is a lot more broken up and like ragged than this one. Right, so we get a much more like kind of beat up noise on the edge. And obviously the more you blur that, the more it'll be beat up, and you can play around with that. But hopefully that helps and kind of gets gets you cooking. I'm going to put a link to this graph in the description so that anyone can use it as reference, just so you can follow along. If you like the video, please. If you like the videos, subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to get a notification when new stuff goes up. I'm looking through the comments and getting lots of great recommendations about what people want to see. I'm surprised that it's mostly simpler stuff, but we can definitely do all that kind of thing. Maybe later we'll make a video about putting these into Unreal as a Decal or ZBrush as a alpha. I think people can probably figure that part out because it's not really designer centric, but if there's appetite for it, mention it in the comments, and that's something we definitely can do. But other than that, thanks so much for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.